the war that defines your future, did not begin on the battlefield. It started in a closed room. No soldiers, no shots fired, just decisions. In 1945, the United States emerged from World War II as the greatest military power in history. But for the first time, this victory did not bring peace. It brought fear. Nuclear fear, ideological fear, fear of losing control of the world they had just saved. While Americans celebrated in New York, Washington, London, and Paris, a new war was already being planned, silent, strategic, invisible. Today, more than 70 years later, that decision still controls where American soldiers fight, where billions of dollars are spent, and why distant conflicts affect your life every day. Before we continue, if you want to understand how past decisions still shape the power of the United States today, please like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This content is not entertainment. It's a manual for understanding the real world. Now, let's go back to the moment when it all began, when victory turned into vulnerability. In 1945, the United States won the greatest war in human history. The American flag flew over devastated Europe. Japan had surrendered, and more than 16 million Americans returned home as heroes. Washington was officially the center of global power. For the first time, a single nation concentrated military, economic, and technological supremacy simultaneously. No previous empire had achieved this level of dominance. But this victory concealed a dangerous weakness. While crowds celebrated in Times Square and Chicago, strategists at the Pentagon and the State Department watched maps with growing unease. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war with the largest land army on the planet, more than 11 million active soldiers. By 1945, Soviet troops controlled virtually all of Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany were under Moscow's direct influence. In less than 5 years, more than 100 million people had been incorporated into the Soviet bloc. For Washington, that wasn't liberation. It was replacement. Germany had been defeated, but in its place, a new ideological power was emerging, armed, expansionist, and deeply hostile to the American democratic model. Internal State Department documents, now declassified, show that American diplomats feared that an economically devastated Europe would become fertile ground for communist revolutions. Unemployment, famine, inflation, and political instability created the perfect environment for institutional collapse. In 1946, Winston Churchill summed up this fear in a historic speech in Missouri. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. That phrase was not rhetoric. It was a strategic warning. The following year, in March 1947, President Harry Truman went to Congress and officially declared that the United States would abandon isolationism. The Truman Doctrine was born. For the first time in peacetime, Washington committed to intervening globally to contain Soviet expansion. American foreign policy ceased to be reactive. It became permanent. Soon after, in 1948, came the Marshall Plan. More than $13 billion, the equivalent of more than $150 billion today, were sent to Western Europe. Officially, it was reconstruction. In practice, it was strategic defense. The United States understood that tanks alone don't win ideological wars. Stable economies do. Each rebuilt port, each reopened factory, each restored railway was a barrier against communism. Even so, it wasn't enough. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin. In response, the United States organized the largest airlift in history, with over 277,000 flights in less than a year. That crisis made it clear. The next war would not begin with gunfire. It would begin with pressure. Inside the White House, President Truman, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and military leaders reached an uncomfortable conclusion. If America retreated, Europe would fall. If Europe fell, the global balance would be disrupted. Something unprecedented needed to be created. On April 4, 1949, in Washington, 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Portugal. NATO was officially born, but the true power of that document lay in a single paragraph. Article 5. An attack against one would be considered an attack against all. This meant that, for the first time in history, the United States was committing itself, by treaty, to automatically go to war to defend other nations. It was the definitive end of the isolation that had marked American politics since George Washington. Many in Congress resisted. Many feared losing sovereignty. Many feared uncontrolled wars. But the fear of inaction was greater. Washington understood that the cost of leadership was permanent. NATO was not born from trust. It was born from distrust. It was not born from force. It was born from fear. Fear of losing Europe. Fear of losing influence. Fear of losing the world that the United States had saved in 1945. At that time, no one imagined that decision would last for more than 7 decades. No one imagined that American soldiers would still be defending European borders in 2026. No one imagined that billions would continue to be invested every year to uphold that promise. But it all started there, in closed rooms, with open maps, and with a silent question. If we don't lead now, who will? And how much will it cost later? The Cold War that never became a total war. In the early 1950s, peace in Europe was merely a fragile illusion. The ruins of World War II still smoldered. Entire cities were under reconstruction, and millions of families struggled to rebuild their lives. But behind the scenes, Washington and Moscow were already at war. A war without trenches, without defined fronts. A war of calculations, threats, and silence. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The American nuclear monopoly was over. For the first time, the United States could be destroyed in a matter of minutes. The Atlantic Ocean, which had previously served as a natural shield, had lost its strategic value. Geography no longer protected anyone. From that moment on, NATO ceased to be merely a political pact. It became a permanent military machine. In 1950, the Korean War confirmed America's worst fears. Communist troops crossed an international border using direct military force. For Washington, this was a rehearsal. If it happened in Asia, it could happen in Germany, Italy, or France. The lesson was clear. Containment needed to be armed. In the following years, the United States began stationing massive forces in Western Europe. Air bases, barracks, ammunition depots, and command centers were built from Norway to Turkey. At its peak, during the 1980s, more than 400,000 American soldiers were permanently stationed on the European continent. It was the largest peacetime military presence in U.S. history. West Germany became the epicenter of this strategy. There, just a few kilometers from Soviet troops, lay the contact line between two worlds. On one side, liberal democracies. On the other, single-party regimes. A mistake, a misunderstanding, a radar misinterpretation could trigger a nuclear war. And it almost happened. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came closer to the end than at any other time. Documents revealed decades later show that American and Soviet officials believed war was virtually inevitable. Nuclear submarines were armed. Strategic bombers were in the air. Missiles were ready for launch. NATO was on high alert. War was avoided through negotiation. But the trauma remained. From that point on, the concept that would define the Cold War was born: mutually assured destruction. If one side attacked, the other would respond. Both would be annihilated. There were no winners, only temporary survivors. NATO transformed this concept into operational doctrine. Ballistic missiles were deployed in Europe. Strategic bombers patrolled constantly. Nuclear submarines crossed oceans silently. Everything served a single purpose: to convince the enemy that attacking was suicide. Peace came to depend on fear. But this balance came at an invisible human cost. For decades, American children learned to hide under desks during nuclear drills. Families built underground shelters. Entire cities had planned evacuation routes. Movies, newspapers, and TV programs reflected the collective anxiety of a society living under constant threat. At the same time, military spending exploded. Between 1950 and 1990, the United States invested trillions of dollars in defense. Much of this investment was directly linked to NATO. The arms, technology, and logistics industries grew on an unprecedented scale. The American economy began to revolve around global security. Crises continued to test the system. The Berlin Wall in 1961 divided families for almost 30 years. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited tensions. The Euro missile crisis in the 1980s once again placed Europe as a potential nuclear battleground. In each of these situations, NATO maintained its position. It wasn't making any progress. He did not back down. I was expecting it. This stance prevented World War III, but it also froze conflicts, sustained unstable regimes, and normalized a state of permanent alert. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many believed that this was finally the definitive victory of the Western model. In 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seemed that NATO's mission had ended. But the question that was beginning to emerge in Washington was another. If the enemy is gone, why is the machine still running? And what happens when an alliance created for war loses its main war? The promise that was never written. In December 1991, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time in the Kremlin. A nuclear, military, and ideological empire had collapsed without firing a single missile at the United States. For Washington, it seemed like the end of history. The greatest strategic rival of the 20th century had disappeared. Liberal democracy and capitalism had won. But behind the scenes, a silent decision was beginning to be made. The Russia that emerged from the Soviet ruins was a wounded country. Its gross domestic product fell by more than 40% in the 1990s. Millions lost jobs, savings, and stability. Male life expectancy plummeted. Inflation destroyed family economies. Former military officers took up driving taxis. Scientists sold equipment to survive. A country accustomed to superpower status now struggled to pay salaries. In Moscow, President Boris Yeltsin was trying to keep Russia integrated with the West. He signed disarmament agreements, opened markets, accepted harsh economic reforms, and cooperated with Washington. The idea was clear: to transform former enemies into partners. At the same time, leaders in Eastern Europe had another fear. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic countries bore deep scars from Soviet domination. For them, the fall of the USSR did not mean security. It meant vulnerability. Without protection, they could be absorbed back into Moscow. They wanted one thing: to join NATO. In diplomatic files now declassified, there are records of meetings held between 1990 and 1991 in which Western leaders informally suggested to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand an inch to the east if Germany were reunified. These promises were never formalized in a treaty. They were never ratified. They were never legally binding. But they remained etched in Russian political memory. During the 1990s, Washington faced a historic dilemma: to end NATO as a Cold War alliance, or to transform it into a permanent instrument of influence. The second option won. In 1994, the Partnership for Peace program was created, officially for military cooperation. In practice, it was a gateway for new members. In 1997, NATO signed an agreement with Russia promising not to station large permanent forces in Eastern Europe. Moscow believed it. It was a gesture of trust. 2 years later, in 1999, the first expansion took place. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, 3 countries that had historically been within Russia's sphere of influence, were now part of an alliance led by the United States. For Washington, it meant stability. For Moscow, it was treason. In 2004, the second wave arrived. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics, officially joined NATO. For the first time, the alliance extended directly to Russia's borders. In addition to them, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania also joined. NATO's strategic border has advanced more than 1,000 kilometers eastward. In Moscow, the narrative changed. The West was no longer seen as a partner. He was seen as a fencer. Vladimir Putin, who assumed the presidency in 2000, interpreted the expansion as proof that Russian weakness was being exploited. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, he delivered a speech that marked a historic turning point. NATO expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. It wasn't rhetoric. It was a warning. American analysts disagreed. Some argued that expansion consolidated democracies. Others warned that it created deep strategic resentment. Internal Clinton administration memos show that there was awareness of the risks. But the political decision had already been made. NATO ceased to be merely defensive. It was becoming geopolitical. The consequence was silent but lasting. Russia began to rebuild its armed forces, modernize its nuclear arsenal, and prepare its society for a long-term confrontation. The conflict of the 21st century began there. Not in Ukraine, not in Georgia, not in Crimea, but in the rooms where the decision was made to move forward without fully integrating those who were being surrounded. And the question that remains is simple. Expansion ensured peace, or did it simply postpone the next war? From defensive alliance to global police. At the beginning of the 21st century, many in Washington believed that NATO had finally found its definitive identity. The Soviet Union had disappeared. Europe was integrated. Democracies seemed consolidated. For the first time since 1949, the largest military alliance in history had no clear enemy. Then, on September 11, 2001, everything changed. In just a few hours, nearly 3,000 Americans died in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. The attack did not come from a rival state. It came from a terrorist network with no defined territory, no regular army, no borders. For the United States, this represented a new type of war, invisible, decentralized, and global. The following day, for the first time in its history, NATO activated Article 5. All the allies declared that the attacks against the United States were attacks against everyone. It was a symbolic moment. The alliance created to contain the Soviet Union was now going to war to defend America against a non-state enemy. In October 2001, American forces invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban regime, which harbored al-Qaeda. Shortly afterward, NATO troops joined the International Security Assistance Force. Soldiers from Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and other countries began patrolling Afghan villages alongside American troops. The war that was supposed to last months lasted 20 years. Between 2001 and 2021, more than 240,000 people died in the conflict, including more than 3,500 coalition soldiers. The United States spent approximately $2 trillion. NATO built bases, trained local forces, funded governments, and attempted to transform a tribal society into a modern state. In the end, it failed. In August 2021, the Taliban retook Kabul. Images of helicopters evacuating American diplomats were reminiscent of Saigon in 1975. For many allies, this was a shock. If NATO had failed to stabilize Afghanistan after 2 decades, what then? Was its real transformative power? The alliance's credibility has suffered a profound blow. Meanwhile, another front was consolidating. In 2014, after protests in Kiev toppled a pro-Russian government, Moscow annexed Crimea. It was the first forced border change in Europe since World War II. NATO responded with sanctions, military reinforcements in Eastern Europe, and joint exercises. But it avoided direct confrontation. It was restraint without war. Tensions built up quietly for years. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Tanks crossed borders. Missiles struck cities. Millions of civilians fled. The largest conventional conflict in Europe since 1945 had begun. NATO did not directly enter the war, but it became its main support. The United States led an effort to send billions of dollars in weapons, intelligence, training, and logistical support. Air defense systems, drones, artillery, anti-tank missiles, and satellites became part of the Ukrainian battlefield. In practice, the alliance entered into a proxy war with Russia. The effect was immediate. Historically neutral countries, such as Finland and Sweden, have applied for membership in NATO. Finland was officially incorporated in 2023. The alliance's direct border with Russia has doubled in size. Europe has returned to war mode. Governments increased military budgets. Ammunition factories were reactivated. The American defense industry entered a period of rapid expansion. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman began operating at full capacity. NATO had transformed itself once again, of defensive alliance, as an instrument for managing global crises. from a regional agreement in a power projection system. But this transformation brought an uncomfortable question. The alliance still protects peace, or does it simply manage ongoing conflicts? From Afghanistan to Ukraine, NATO has learned that modern wars don't end with treaties. They drag on. They consume resources. They wear down societies. They test democracies. And increasingly, they are placing the United States at the center of all decisions. Because, in the end, when all else fails, it is Washington that pays the bill. And it is the American people who live with the consequences. The price of global leadership. In the post-2022 world, NATO is no longer just a military alliance. It is the central axis of the international order, led by the United States. Every decision made in Brussels, Washington, or at bases scattered throughout Europe has a direct impact on the American economy, national security, and the daily lives of millions of citizens. Since the end of the Cold War, many politicians have promised that peace dividends would allow for reduced military spending and greater investment in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. This promise has never materialized. On the contrary, in 2024, the United States defense budget exceeded $850 billion. A large part of this amount is directly or indirectly linked to the commitment to NATO, maintaining troops in Europe, sustaining missile defense systems, funding joint exercises, producing weapons for allies, and ensuring permanent readiness costs hundreds of billions over decades. This money doesn't come from thin air. It comes from taxes, public debt, and political choices. Global leadership comes at a price. At the same time, there is the moral dilemma that has accompanied this leadership since 1949. Whenever an ally is threatened, Washington faces the same question. How far are we willing to go to defend it? Article 5 is not symbolic. It is binding. If a small country in the Baltic is attacked, American soldiers can be automatically sent to the front, not by emotional choice, by legal obligation. This means that citizens of the United States may be called upon to fight for borders they have never visited, for cities they may never have heard of, for decisions made decades before they were born. This is the invisible cost of stability. In the current scenario, the challenge is even greater. Russia remains a nuclear power. China is expanding its military influence in the Indo-Pacific. Iran operates through allied groups in the Middle East. North Korea regularly tests missiles. The world has ceased to be unipolar. It has become multipolar, fragmented, and unpredictable. In this context, NATO functions as the main pillar of American strategy. It allows the United States to multiply its power through allies. Instead of acting alone, they act as a bloc. Instead of bearing all the costs, they share some of them. Instead of isolating conflicts, they internationalize the response. But this same structure limits freedom of action. Washington no longer makes decisions alone. Every crisis demands consensus. Every operation requires negotiation. Every response involves 30 countries with differing interests. American leadership has become more complex, slower, and more politically sensitive. At the same time, American society changed. After 2 decades of war in the Middle East, an entire generation grew up watching veterans return with physical and psychological trauma. More than 7,000 American soldiers died in Afghanistan and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands live with post-traumatic stress disorder. Trillions were spent on distant conflicts. This created strategic fatigue. Some of the public question whether it's worth continuing to be the world's policeman. Others believe that retreating would open the door for authoritarian regimes to dominate entire regions. This debate divides elections, parties, and families. NATO is at the center of this dispute because it represents a choice made in 1949 to lead, even at risk. Today, every missile sent to Ukraine, every reinforced base in Poland, every ship patrolling the Baltic is a direct consequence of that agreement signed in Washington more than 70 years ago. None of this is improvised. Everything is inherited. The real question is not whether NATO is still necessary. The question is, are the United States still willing to pay the price for the order they created? Because if they retreat, others will advance. If they hesitate, others will decide. And if they abandon this system, the void will be filled, not by democracies, but by powers that do not share the same values. History shows that empires don't fall solely due to military defeats. They collapse from exhaustion, due to indecision, because they forgot why they started. NATO exists because, in 1949, America decided that leadership was a responsibility, not a privilege. Today, that decision remains valid, but it requires awareness. It demands debate. It requires informed citizens, because the future of the largest military alliance in history, it will not be decided solely by generals and presidents. It will be decided by you. From what I understand, based on what you accept, and what are you willing to stand for?